What did people really eat in the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago? For centuries, we have imagined the biblical table as something simple: bread, fish, a cup of wine. Modest, perhaps, but peaceful. But what if that image misses the most important part? What if the table we imagine never existed, not because the food was different, but because reaching that table required something we no longer understand? Before bread could be broken, grain had to be crushed. Before fire could bake, fuel had to be found. Before a family could gather, someone had already worked for hours in silence, their body bent, their hands raw. This was not abundance, it was survival, measured in calories burned, in fuel conserved, in rain that either came or did not come. In this video, we walk the path food took from the earth to the table. Stay until the end, because what you discover changes how we read the most familiar words in the Gospels. In the time of Jesus, food did not begin at the table. It began on the floor, hours before sunrise, with a sound that filled the house, the grinding of stone against stone. Every morning, someone in the family, almost always a woman, knelt on the ground and began the work of turning grain into flour. This was not optional. Flour could not be stored. Within days, it would spoil. The only solution was to grind what you needed every single day. The older method used a reciprocal quern. A flat stone sat on the ground. A smaller stone was pushed forward and pulled back, crushing the grain. The woman's body leaned into the motion, her arms driving the weight again and again. This process took approximately 3 hours. And during those 3 hours, the woman's body was burning calories she would need to replace with the very bread she was preparing. This was a caloric debt. The energy required to make food had to be extracted from the food itself. If the harvest had been poor, that debt became dangerous. Then came the rotary quern. The upper stone now turned in a circle, driven by a wooden handle. The motion was faster, smoother, more efficient. This method reduced the time required by nearly half. And critically, it saved the woman significant calories per day. In a world where survival was measured in stored jars of grain and the physical capacity to endure winter illness, those extra calories could mean the difference between a body that healed and a body that gave out. Flour, once ground, did not wait. It had to be mixed, kneaded, and allowed to ferment, or not, depending on time. Bread without leaven was denser, faster. Bread with leaven required patience. The dough had to rest. And once ready, it had to be baked. But baking required fire, and fire required fuel. The clay oven stood outside the house or near the entrance where smoke could escape. The most common type was the tanner, a vertical cylinder made of clay mixed with straw. The fuel was burned inside, directly on the base. And once the walls absorbed enough heat, the baking could begin. In the highlands of Judea, wood was scarce. What little wood existed was reserved for construction. For fuel, families relied on dried animal dung. It burned slowly, producing steady heat. It smoldered, releasing smoke that hung in the air, irritating the eyes and lungs. This shaped what could be cooked. Foods that required long, sustained heat were out of reach. What remained were foods that could be prepared quickly. Bread, flatbreads, thick stews. The fuel dictated the menu. When the tanner was ready, the baker took a piece of dough, flattened it, and in a single motion slapped it onto the hot inner wall. The dough stuck. It began to puff. Within 60 seconds, it was done. Any longer, and it would char. Any less, and it would remain raw. This was not forgiving. There was no timer, no margin for error. The woman's hands moved by feel, by memory, by years of repetition. She baked multiple loaves in succession. By the time the last came out, the first was already cooling. Bread was eaten warm. By the next day, it had hardened. And so the cycle repeated. Homes had no chimneys. Respiratory illness was common, especially in winter. The very act of preparing food carried a biological cost. But bread alone could not sustain a body. To survive, the diet required something more. Lentils were the food of necessity, but they were also the most intelligent component of the first-century diet. Because lentils, along with chickpeas and broad beans, did something no other crop could do. They fixed nitrogen in the soil. Wheat and barley depleted the earth. After a harvest, the soil was weaker. If a field was used year after year without rest, yields dropped. The land gave less until it gave nothing. Legumes reversed this. Their roots formed a partnership with bacteria, pulling nitrogen from the air and storing it. When the crop was harvested and the roots remained, that nitrogen stayed behind, enriching the soil for wheat the following season. Farmers understood, through generations of observation, that rotating legumes with grains kept the land alive. They saw the results. A field planted with lentils one year produced better wheat the next. But legumes were not just soil medicine. They were famine insurance. Unlike bread, which had to be consumed within days, dried lentils could be stored for years. They did not spoil. When the rains failed, when the wheat harvest fell short, when tax collectors took more than expected, the legumes remained. Legumes provided the protein that bread could not. In a diet where meat was rare, lentils became the poor man's meat. A family that had legumes had options. A family without them was one bad season away from desperation. The preparation was simple. The dried legumes were soaked overnight, then boiled slowly. Oil was added if the family could afford it. The result was a thick pottage, eaten by dipping bread into the bowl. This was the meal. Repeated day after day, it was stability in a world that offered very little of it. But not all food came from the land. In the Galilee, another source of calories was being processed on an industrial scale. The town of Magdala sat on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. In Greek, it was called Tarishi, the place of salted fish. Magdala was not a fishing village. It was a processing center, designed to take fresh fish from the lake and transform them into a commodity that could survive months of transport. Excavations have uncovered dozens of plastered salting vats. These were large, standardized, built for volume. Fish were brought in fresh and immediately transferred to the vats. The heat worked against preservation. A fish left unprocessed would begin to rot. The fish were layered with coarse sea salt, harvested from coastal lagoons and transported inland. The salt drew moisture from the tissues, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. Over several weeks, the fish dried, hardened, stabilized. What emerged could be packed into amphorae and sent across the province. This was not food for local consumption alone. Magdala's salted fish fed Roman soldiers in distant garrisons. It supplied urban markets, It was part of a trade network that linked rural Galilee to the imperial economy. The peasants who lived near the lake ate what remained. The smaller fish, the less valuable cuts, the byproducts of a system designed for export. One byproduct was garum, a fermented fish sauce made from viscera and smaller fish. The result was a thick liquid rich in salt and protein. It was a staple of the Roman military diet. The amphorae themselves were marvels of standardization. Their shapes and sizes had been refined to fit ship holds, pack animals, warehouse storage. Wine amphorae were cylindrical, lined with resin. Oil amphorae were bulbous, thick-walled, left unlined. Each design was optimized for its cargo. The peasant eating salted fish in a Judean village was participating in an economy that stretched across the Mediterranean. But fish was not the only substance that crossed every domain of life. Olive oil was not just food, it was infrastructure. It was the primary source of dietary fat, but it was also the fuel that lit the night, the base for medicines, the waterproofing agent that sealed cistern plaster. Olive oil crossed every boundary because resource scarcity demanded that nothing serve a single purpose. The olive tree was a slow investment. It took years to mature, but once established, it could produce for generations. The first press produced the highest quality oil, clear, mild, suitable for food and trade. The second press produced darker, heavier oil. This was what poor families used for lighting. It was smokier, more acrid, and irritated the eyes and lungs throughout the night. Lighting was not optional. A house in total darkness was dangerous. A lamp had to remain lit, even if only faintly. The oil burned slowly, but over a winter night it added up. Families measured oil carefully. Oil's most critical function may have been in water storage. The cisterns that held rainwater were lined with hydraulic plaster designed to prevent water from seeping into bedrock. And olive oil, applied carefully to the surface, helped maintain that seal. Inside the home, oil was used medicinally. Mixed with herbs, it soothed burns and wounds. It was rubbed into skin cracked by sun and wind. And yet, for all its uses, it was always measured, always conserved. Because oil, like grain, was subject to taxation. The best oil went to the market, to the tax collector. What remained was divided among the lamp, the kitchen, and the body. The ubiquity of olive oil in the archaeological record speaks to its centrality. It was the thread that held the household together. But even with oil, bread, and stew prepared, the family still had to eat, and the act of eating carried a hidden cost. At night, the family gathered. The meal was simple: bread, a bowl of lentil stew, perhaps a bit of cheese. The food was placed in the center. Everyone reached in. Bread was torn, dipped into the communal bowl, eaten. There were no individual plates. There were no utensils beyond the bread itself. This was structure. Eating together was an act of solidarity, of family cohesion, of religious observance. To share a meal was to acknowledge kinship. The table was a space where identity was affirmed. But there was something else in that bowl. Analysis of remains from first-century latrines has revealed a high prevalence of intestinal parasites: whipworm, roundworm, giardia. These parasites spread through contaminated hands, contaminated water, and contaminated fingers dipping into a shared bowl. The source was not mysterious. Human waste was used as fertilizer, night soil collected and spread across fields, enriched the crops, but it ensured that parasite eggs remained in the soil, on the vegetables, in the water. The cycle was closed. Eat, excrete, fertilize, harvest, eat again. The consequences were chronic. Whipworm caused anemia. Roundworm led to malnutrition. Giardia caused acute dysentery. Even in elite households, these infections were present. The act of eating together was a vector for disease. And yet, the practice did not change. To eat alone was to be isolated, outside the community. The communal bowl was the physical manifestation of belonging. Illness was common. Children died frequently. But the social imperative overrode the biological cost. Many children did not survive to their 5th year. Those who did often showed signs of stunted growth. The shared bowl was part of the environment that made survival difficult. And even for those who survived, another threat loomed larger. A threat from the absence of what should fall from the sky. The agricultural year began in October. That was when the early rains were supposed to arrive. Without those rains, plowing was impossible. The ground was too hard. The entire season depended on water arriving on schedule, but the rain did not always come. In some years, October passed, then November, then December. The cisterns remained low. The planting was delayed, and if the early rains finally came late, the late rains in spring might fail as well. A drought that lasted across multiple seasons meant total crop failure. When the harvest failed, stored reserves became everything. Families with enough grain had a buffer. Families with only a few months entered a countdown. First, they consumed the wheat, then the barley, then the lentils, and when the legumes ran out, they turned to wild foods. Carob pods, wild roots, in desperate cases, seeds picked from animal dung. Evidence shows that multi-year droughts did occur during the 1st century. When they did, the social fabric unraveled, because even if a family had food, they still had obligations. Roman taxes had to be paid. Temple tithes were expected. Landlords demanded rents, all calculated based on a normal harvest. When the harvest failed, the peasant had no surplus. He could not pay his taxes, and so he borrowed. From wealthy landowners, from anyone with reserves. The loan might carry the family through one season, but the debt remained. And if the next harvest also failed, the farmer could not repay. The land was sold. Roman taxation, local rents, and temple obligations could consume the majority of a peasant's harvest. What remained had to feed the family and provide seed. If the harvest was good, the system held. Barely. If the harvest was poor, the system collapsed. The survival margin was measured in weeks. How many weeks could the family survive before they had to make impossible choices? The line between subsistence and desperation was thin, and the rain determined which side of that line the family stood on. This was the context in which daily bread was not a metaphor, it was a literal calculation. How much grain is left? Will the rains come? To understand what people really ate in the time of Jesus is to understand that food was the output of a system under constant pressure. A system where every calorie consumed had to be earned through labor, where every meal depended on variables no one controlled, and where every harvest was subject to extraction. The hours spent grinding grain, the 60-second window to bake bread, the layering of fish in salt, the the storage of lentils as insurance, the oil that lit the night and sealed the cistern, the shared bowl that bound the family even as it spread disease, the rain that either came or did not come. All of this was the table. When ancient texts speak of daily bread, of hunger, of provision, they are not speaking in metaphors. They are speaking from the floor where flour had to be ground before sunrise, from the courtyard where fire filled the air with smoke, from the field where the failure of rain meant the failure of everything. Understanding this anchors faith. It shows that the words spoken 2,000 years ago were born from the same struggle that defined every life, every family, every season. The table was not a place of abundance. It was a place where scarcity was managed, where risk was calculated, and where survival was negotiated day by day. And perhaps that is what makes it worth understanding, because when we see the material reality behind the words, we see that the concerns were not abstract. They were immediate, they were physical, they were real. And if this documentary expanded your understanding of the first-century world, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Until the next one.